All right, here we are at the door again. I'm Michael Pearl, and we're going to answer some of your Bible questions tonight. These are questions that you sent in. Question number 28. Do you think damnation always refers to eternal damnation? If so, how can we live with Romans 3:2 and 1 Corinthians 9:11-29? Because who hasn't resisted powers at some point? Who knows that they didn't take communion unworthy at one time? This is Ryan. All right. I'm going to answer your question, but I'd rather teach you how to fish than just catch a fish and feed it to you. Now, anytime you have a Bible question like that, what you do is you, first of all, you read the passage and analyze it. In other words, break it down. What's the subject? What's the verb? What's the modifiers? What's the context before and after? What's the context of the whole chapter? What's the context of the book? Where did the subject begin? In other words, he might have begun the chapter before discussing some point, and this is part of the developing argument. And then he will also conclude it toward the end of that chapter and the next chapter. So you'll want to look at the whole picture like that. And then what you want to do is word studies. Take your English concordance. You can do it on a computer is the way I do it. And look up every time each one of the critical words are used to find out what the definition of those words are. That's actually better than using the Greek. I use Greek, but the shortcut and sometimes more accurate is just to see what the King James English says in the multiple uses of a word. So that's what we've done here. Now let's read the passage that he is concerned with. He's concerned about damnation. Is it eternal damnation or some kind of other damnation? If it's eternal damnation, he said, we're in trouble. Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject to the higher powers. That was Barack Obama at one time. Now it's, what's the guy's name? Trump. For there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. In other words, whoever's in control of the government, whoever the head attorney general is, whoever the sheriff is, those people are the ones that are appointed by God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So it's a common fallacy to derive a vocabulary from the Bible and take words like damnation or justification or saved and give them one theological meaning and try to read that theological meaning into every time you see the word. And these words were words popular in common language before they were used by Bible writers. So they have a meaning apart from the immediate theological context. So what does the word damnation mean here? Most people think of it strictly as going to hell. He said rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. So he's talking about obeying the rulers lest we end up damned. And he says, for the rulers are not a terror to good works, but they are a terror to evil. Will thou then not be afraid of the power? And that's the government, and that's the law enforcement. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. So the context tells us that the damnation is the jurisdiction of government to bring punishment upon us if we violate the laws under which we live here in our country, whatever country that is. It says, for he, I'm not skipping any, I'm reading the passage straight through, he is the minister of God to thee for good, the government is. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God. He is a revenger, government, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So it says God has appointed governments to execute wrath on people who do evil. It said, for he beareth not the sword in vain. In other words, God gives to government the power to use force, guns, swords, whatever, tasers, to subdue lawless people, to incarcerate them, and in some cases to use a sword to cut their head off, or lethal injection, whatever means is used, to execute them, to kill them. So he's warning that if you disobey the powers that be, which powers God put in place to punish evildoers, you could suffer damnation from those powers. So no, this is not talking about going to hell. And if you look up the word damnation throughout the Bible, you'll find that it's used 11 times in the New Testament, none in the Old Testament. And it qualifies each time it's used. Well, most of the time it's used, it qualifies it. For instance, it says damnation of hell. Another place it says eternal damnation. Another place it says that the evil go through the resurrection of damnation. So he qualifies it in telling us what the nature of that damnation is. Now, there are also places like this one where damnation, 3 times, where damnation is used, and it is in a secular sense, a local sense, not divine damnation. 2 Peter 2:3 says, "And through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now for a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth not." Now this is eternal damnation here. "For God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell." So he defines this damnation as being cast down to hell, delivered them into chains of darkness. So the context in the next verse defines the damnation. Now here's the 3 verses out of the 11 that is not damnation as unto hell. 1 Corinthians 11:29, "For he that eateth, drinketh damnation, he that eateth and drinketh unworthily, eateth and drinketh damnation to himself." This is the passage he quoted where he said, every one of us has at some times or another taken the Lord's table in an unworthy condition. Now that's a total misunderstanding. If you get my messages on 1 Corinthians and look in chapter 7, you'll come to understand that. But let's cover it here briefly. He's talking about the manner in which they were taking the Lord's table, not about the condition of the one taking it. He wasn't saying that they should be worthy to take the Lord's table. He was saying that the manner in which they do it, the adverb worthily, that the manner in which they were doing it should be worthy of the event itself, not their personal condition. So he eateth and drinketh unworthily, eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. You say, well, doesn't that mean you're going to go to hell if you abuse the Lord's table, if you take it in an improper manner? Now, the way they were doing it, he said that they were getting together and turning the Lord's table into a big feast, and that the wealthier people were getting there early with lots of good food to eat and were gorging on the food, while the poor people came in and didn't have much to eat. So he said that's an unworthy way to take the Lord's table. He said if you do that, you eat and drink damnation to yourself. Now, does that mean going to hell? No, the context goes on. "For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you." So many of the Christians who'd misused the Lord's table were physically weak, some were sick, and he said, and many sleep. They had died. They died, God had killed them, chastened them unto death because of their misuse of the Lord's table. That was the damnation. It wasn't to hell. For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. So God's judgment was to bring sickness, weakness, physical weakness, and death on them for abuse of the Lord's table. For when we are judged, we're chastened of the Lord. I can see some of you listening to this are arguing with me, well, I don't know why you wouldn't say it's damnation to hell. For when we are judged, we're chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. So he says very clearly that this condemnation doesn't result in a condemnation that the world experiences, which would be unto hell. This is a condemnation of the Christian who dies as a Christian, goes to heaven, but he is chastened unto death. So the context is quite clear there. Isn't it amazing how just reading the Bible clears up so many questions? You don't need to be a theologian. You You don't need theology books. You don't need Mike Pearl on YouTube. If you just read your Bible, get your concordance, and search out the words, look at it carefully, it's always self-explanatory. In fact, the Bible is written in such a way that it goes overboard to be self-explanatory. Now, here's another one, 1 Timothy 5:9. He talks about a widow. I'm going to skip some of it. He said, widows having damnation because they cast off their first faith. He said, when you have a widow, if she's under 60 years of age, let her get married again and keep house and raise children. If she's over 60 years of age and she wants to submit to the church, to be a servant and a minister in the church, then she can make that commitment, and then the church will assume all the responsibilities for upkeep. It says, now, don't take any younger women than 60, because if you do, he said, they'll start being busybodies, going about from house to house, nothing to do, and talking, and as a result, he said, younger women refuse, for when they began to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation because they cast off their first faith, wherewithal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers and busybodies, speaking those things they ought not. So the damnation here is not going to hell, but it's the judgment that would be brought upon them for their misuse of this privilege they've been granted by the church.